The tin can had been on the third shelf of the root cellar for 11 years. It sat between a jar of crystallized honey and a spare belt for the tiller, and it looked like nothing. It looked like something a person would throw away without thinking twice. The medical tape wrapped around the lid had gone yellow at the edges, and the 2 words written on it in pencil had faded to almost nothing, but Willa Vance could read them in complete darkness if she had to. Do not. She stood at the edge of the east field at 5 a.m. on August 14th, 1977, and held the can in both hands the way her mother had taught her to hold things that mattered. Not tight, just present. The field in front of her had not seen rain in 43 days. The soil had pulled away from itself in long, shallow cracks that ran like old scars through the dirt, and the wheat that still stood did so without conviction, yellowed and bent, and waiting to be told it was finished. Willa was 51 years old. She had been reading this land since she was 9. She knew what finished looked like, and she knew what the field in front of her was telling her, and she had known it since March when she wrote it in her notebook before anyone else in Greer County had thought to be afraid. She did not open the can yet. She stood with it and looked east past the fence line to where the Henderson property began. What had been a wheat field 2 months ago was now something else entirely, something flat and pale and quietly catastrophic. Beyond that, further than she could see in the gray, pre-dawn light, was the Murphy place. And beyond that was Garland Cross and his 2,000 acres, and beyond that was a county that was running out of time in ways that showed up on clipboards and balance sheets, and in the faces of men who had stopped sleeping. She looked the other way toward the county road. A vehicle had parked there the previous evening, just past the fence post with the broken reflector, and sat with its engine running for 20 minutes before pulling away. She had watched it from the kitchen window without moving. She knew whose vehicle it was. She had known since the first time it came 3 days ago that it would come back and that the third visit would be different from the second, and that she needed whatever was in this can to be in the ground before that happened. She pried off the lid. Inside, wrapped in cheesecloth tied with a length of brown twine that her mother had knotted sometime in the late 1940s, were seeds. Small and dark and unremarkable. They looked like something swept off a kitchen floor. They looked like nothing at all. But Willa Vance had been waiting 11 years for the right conditions to plant them, and the right conditions had arrived with a particular cruelty, and she was not a woman who confused cruelty with accident. She counted what was there. She had counted before twice, in the years since her mother died, just to check viability, just to make sure. There was enough for 3/4 of an acre of tepary beans along the fence line, half an acre of amaranth, where the soil had been building nitrogen for 6 years, and perhaps a 1/4 acre of the variety her mother had written about in the small green notebook in Norwegian, the one she called the dry summer bean, the one she had noted with 2 underlines was resilient, in conditions of extreme moisture deficit, producing viable yield in soils that had received less than 8 inches of rain in a growing season. Greer County's cumulative rainfall for 1977, as of this morning, was 6.5 inches. Willa replaced the lid. She walked back to the house to get her tools and to start the coffee before Cole woke up, because what was coming next was going to require her son in a particular state of mind. And Cole Vance's state of mind before coffee was not a resource she intended to waste. She had not told him about the can, not really. He knew it existed the way children know about things they have been kept from knowing, which is to say, incompletely, and with a vague resentment he had never once articulated. He was 26 years old, and he had his father's face and his father's practicality, and enough of her stubbornness to be useful in an emergency, which was what this was, though most of Greer County had not quite accepted that word yet. Raymond Vance had died in 1973. heart attack at 53, which the county doctor called inevitable, given the cigarettes and the constitution of a man who treated rest as a moral failing. Cole had been 22. He had come home from working a grain elevator in Dodge City and had stepped into a farm that needed running, and a mother who needed nothing. Or so she appeared, and he had stayed because that was the kind of man he was, his father's kind, the kind that does not discuss the staying. Willa poured water into the percolator and set it on the burner and opened her notebook to the page she had written the night before. It is time for the can. She had underlined it twice. She turned back to June to the entry where she had first written down the moisture deficit pattern developing across the southwestern corner of the county. She read her own handwriting in the early morning quiet and felt the specific loneliness of being right about something important before anyone else has thought to look. She heard Cole's boots on the stairs at 7:15. He came into the kitchen and poured coffee and stood at the counter and looked at the table where her notebook was open, and a hand-drawn planting diagram on graph paper lay beside it. He studied the diagram with the unhurried attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. Then he looked at her. "What is that?" His voice was not quite a question. "New planting plan." She said it the way she said most things, without looking up from what she was doing. He picked up the graph paper. She watched him read it without watching him, the way a person can track movement in a room without turning their head. He could see the fence lines. He could see the east boundary strip. He could see the notation in the corner that read TBDSB in her small, careful handwriting. He sat down. "What is TB?" "Tepary bean. The seeds from your grandmother's can." A silence that had weight to it. He set the diagram down. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked out the window at the land, at the cracked earth, and the yellowing wheat, and the sky that had been the same hard blue for 6 weeks. Then he put a piece of paper on the table. She had not seen him bring it in. She looked at it. It was a notice informal, but understood passed between the farming families of the county. The way such things were passed, not through the mail, not through any official channel, but through the particular gravity of men who knew each other from church and the feed store, and 30 years of watching each other's fortunes rise and fall. Garland Cross's name was at the top. A meeting at the First Lutheran Friday evening. The subject was a proposal from a company called Midwest Agricon. Willa's name was not on the list of those invited. "They are not inviting you." Cole said it carefully, watching her read. "I know. Henderson already signed. Murphy is close." He paused. "Agricon is offering $1,400 an acre." She looked at the number. 412 acres. She did the arithmetic without moving her lips. If enough neighbors sell the county road easement changes. Cross has been talking to the commissioners. She looked out the window at the east fence line. The land where the tepary beans and the amaranth and the dry summer variety would go in the ground this morning if Cole would stop talking long enough for her to get to it. If the easement changes. She said it quietly, the implication completing itself. Your land gets landlocked. He said it straight, which she appreciated. She stood up and carried her cup to the sink. She looked at the diagram on the table, at the careful pencil lines of where each variety would go, at the spacing notes in the margins at 11 years of waiting, resolved into a quarter page of graph paper. "Get the small tiller out," she said. "We start along the east fence." He looked at her for a moment longer than the request required. Then he stood and put his cup in the sink and went to get the tiller without saying what she knew he was thinking, which was that people were already talking, and that this would give them more to talk about, and that he could not see how a can of old seeds was an answer to $1,400 an acre, and a county that was 3 weeks from serious trouble. She could see it. That was the difference between them. The Vance property had been in the family since 1914, when Willa's father Gustav had purchased the first 200 acres from a man who had broken trying to dry farm sorghum without understanding what the ground was telling him. Gustav had been a quiet, methodical man who kept ledgers and rotated his crops the way some men said their prayers out of a belief that the practice itself contained the protection. He had come from Norway at 23 and had looked at the flat, relentless plains of southwestern Kansas and had seen something in them that most people missed, which was patience. The land was patient. It could wait out almost anything. Willa's mother, Ingrid, had been different from Gustav in the ways that mattered most. She had come from the coastal province of Hordaland, from a family of women who farmed not as a livelihood, but as a conversation with something that did not speak in words. Ingrid's mother and her mother before that had practiced what they called planting in layers, a method that had no official name in any agricultural manual, because it had never been written down by anyone who wrote agricultural manuals. The idea was simple, and took a lifetime to do correctly. You never planted a single crop where a crisis might take it all. You kept what they called a hidden reserve varieties held back from your main rotation, not because they were inferior, but because they were adapted to conditions your main crops could not survive. It was biological insurance. It was the logic of a people who had watched enough winters to know that the worst ones never announced themselves. Ingrid had brought seeds from Norway in 1921, packed in a cloth with dried lavender against the insects. Some were coastal varieties that had no business in Kansas and were planted once noted and abandoned without grief. Others she had gathered along the way, drought-hardy tepary beans from a seed exchange in Missouri. An amaranth strain from a Navajo seed keeper she had met at a market in New Mexico during a cross-country stop. A dry summer bean variety from a Mexican-American farm worker in Colorado who had handed the seeds over with both hands like an offering and said nothing that needed translating. A perennial variety from a Mennonite family in Oklahoma who had pressed the envelope into Ingrid's hands at a roadside and said, "These are for when times change, and times always change." She had kept these varieties alive for 40 years, in the margins of the Vance property, in the fence lines, and the waste ground, always just enough to maintain viability, never enough to draw questions. She had told Willa and Willa's older sister that these seeds were not to be planted all at once. "You are not betting on one moment," she had said, in the particular combination of Norwegian and accented English that had never quite resolved into a single language. "No moment is certain. You keep something back. You always keep something back." Willa's sister had moved to Denver in 1950 and married an accountant and had not particularly retained this lesson. Willa had held it the way she held most of what her mother gave her, which was close and without announcement. When Ingrid died in 1966, Willa had gone to the old family property, which had been sold by then, to a family named Hartley, and had asked politely, but without room for negotiation, to retrieve one item from the root cellar. The Hartleys had let her in. She had taken the tin can. She had opened it once in the 11 years since, just to look, just to check. Then she had replaced the lid and wrapped the tape and written the 2 words and set it back on the shelf. "Do not." The second word was there, understood, yet. The morning passed in the particular silence of serious physical work done in heat. Cole ran the tiller along the east fence line in shallow passes, and Willa followed behind him, on her knees dropping seeds into the furrows at the spacing she had calculated, 4 inches apart, rows 18 inches wide. It was intimate work. You could not do it from a tractor. Each seed was a deliberate act, and by the time she had planted 50 feet of row, her back was aching, and the sun had committed itself to the day. and she had been thinking for an hour about the distance between what she knew and what she could prove. Cole had not asked again about what she was planting. He had run the tiller and watched her work, and once brought her a jar of water from the house without saying anything about it, and she had drunk it and handed it back, and he had gone back to the tiller, and she thought that whatever else Raymond had given their son, he had given him the understanding that there are kinds of help that do not require conversation. She planted the tepary beans first, then the amaranth, which went in the richer soil at the center of the strip, where 6 years of cover crops had been building organic matter in the slow, patient way that could not be hurried and could not be bought. The dry summer bean went in last, in the driest section of the strip in soil that most people would have looked at and seen as marginal. She saw it differently. She had been seeing it differently since 1968, when she had first begun running legume strips along this fence line, and had written in her notebook that the soil here had a quality. The main field lacked a faint biological aliveness, a microbiome that the heavier conventional farming elsewhere in the county had pressed out of existence over 2 decades of chemical inputs and compaction. She had not used those words. She had written, "Warm the soil here still knows something." She had underlined it once, which for Willa Vance was the equivalent of a declaration. The second vehicle came at 2 in the afternoon. She heard the engine before she saw it. Something different from a farm truck, quieter and more deliberate, and she stood up from the row she was working and watched it come down the gravel drive without hurrying. A dark SUV that parked in the yard and sat for a moment before the door opened. The man who stepped out was 38 years old and wore a gray suit that had been well chosen for a different kind of day than this one. His shoes were leather dark brown, and they picked up the dust and the mud at the edge of the yard with the indifference of something that would be cleaned later. He carried nothing in his hands. His name was Doyle Hatch. He worked for Midwest Agricon out of their regional office in Wichita, and he had a degree from Northwestern and 12 counties across 3 states, where he had walked up to farmhouses and made offers that had been refused and then accepted. He did not knock at the front door. He walked around the side of the house toward the sound of the tiller, which Cole had shut off when the SUV came in, and he rounded the corner into the backyard where Willa was standing at the edge of the garden, with her hands still carrying the soil of the morning. He introduced himself. He had the smooth, even cadence of a man who had given this introduction many times. Not unpleasant, professionally warm, which was a particular kind of temperature Willa did not trust. He told her about Agricon's regional acquisition program. He told her about the industrial irrigation system they planned to bring in the infrastructure investment, the long-term projections. He told her about the price per acre, which she already knew from the paper Cole had put on the table that morning. He told her that 30 days was the standard window, that the checks were certified, that the process was straightforward for landowners who engaged early. He put the offer letter on the brick ledge beside the garden. Willa looked at it. Then she looked at the east fence line, where the seeds she had been placing in the ground for 6 hours were invisible beneath the soil, doing nothing, yet just waiting. "I am not selling." She said it the way she said most things without looking at him. Hatch did not leave. He stood where he was and looked at the yard and the house and the equipment and the general condition of things with the evaluating eye of a man who was calculating the distance between where a person was and where they would eventually end up. Then his voice shifted, not dramatically, just slightly, the professional warmth adjusting toward something more direct. He said that he understood her position. He said that she had a son on the property and a loan with First Agricultural Bank on equipment purchased in 1974, and that Agricon had relationships with a number of financial institutions in the region, and that he was mentioning this not as a threat, but so that she had a complete picture. She stood up. She was 5'3", and her hands were black with soil, and her hair had gone from brown to white. so gradually over the past decade that she had never quite noticed when the change completed itself. She looked at Doyle Hatch the way she looked at everything she needed to understand, which was directly and without hurry. "The next time you want to speak with me," she said, "you knock on the front door." She turned and walked into the house. She heard him stand in the yard for a moment. She heard his footsteps on the gravel going back to the SUV. She did not hear Cole's voice until after the engine started and the vehicle was backing toward the road, and then she heard it clearly, the low exchange of two men near the fence, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched, and did not go out. Cole came in 20 minutes later. He poured coffee and stood at the counter and did not look at her. "What did he say?" She asked it without raising her voice. He introduced himself. Cole set his cup down. He said Agricon was committed to supporting landowners who wanted to stay on as farm managers under the new structure. "Equity share," he said. "Guaranteed income." She looked at the window. "I told him we were not interested." Cole said it quickly before she could ask, and she heard the quality in it, the slightly too fast delivery that meant there was something adjacent to what he was saying, that he was not saying. She let it sit. There were things to know about her son, and one of them was that he would tell her when he was ready. Ready in that pressing him before he was ready produced the same result as pressing a bruise, which was pain without information. That evening, she sat at the writing desk in the corner of the front room with the 20-second composition notebook open in front of her. She had started keeping notebooks in 1955, the year after Raymond had told her, not unkindly, that what she was doing with the Northfield was irregular and that the extension office recommended otherwise. She had written down the date and the weather and the moisture conditions and what she had observed about the soil in the Northfield and what she expected to happen based on that observation. Then she had planted the Northfield the way she had planned and watched what happened. The Northfield had outperformed every other section of the Vance property for the next 8 years. Raymond had never quite connected those two facts. Or if he had kept the connection to himself, which was also his kind of love. She opened the notebook to the last entry and wrote one sentence. Then she turned back to June, to the page she had written when she first noticed the pattern, and she read her own handwriting in the lamplight. Then she turned further back, past May, past March, to a page from February when she had written something she had not shared with anyone because it was not about the coming drought. It was about what would happen to this county's water table if an industrial irrigation operation of the scale Agricon was proposing were to establish itself across the primary aquifer recharge zone in the east and south sections of the county. She had been watching the water table in this specific corridor for 14 years. She had numbers. She closed the notebook. Outside the window, the sky was the dense black of a moonless Kansas night, and somewhere under the east fence line in soil that still held the warmth of the afternoon, a 1/4 acre of seeds that no agricultural database had ever cataloged were lying in the dark and doing what seeds do in the dark, which is not sleeping, not waiting, but preparing. She went to the root cellar. She stood in front of the shelf where the tin can had been and looked at the space it had left. Then she looked at the row of small jars she had begun to accumulate over the past several weeks, each one labeled in her handwriting, each one containing a portion of the harvest she was already planning for the seeds she would need to set aside from this first planting to give the variety what it needed to continue. Always keep something back, her mother had said. You keep it for when times change. She thought about the offer letter on the garden ledge. She had not touched it. She would deal with it in the morning the way she dealt with everything that arrived, demanding an immediate response, which was to give it a night to become what it actually was. She turned off the light in the cellar and climbed the steps into the yard and stood for a moment in the night air. The heat of the day had not fully released yet. The sky was enormous and indifferent the way it always was out here, and the fields lay around the house in every direction like a dark extension of everything she had spent her life learning to read. 43 days without rain, 6.5 inches for the year. And somewhere in the east fence strip in the soil her mother had never seen, and her grandmother had never heard of seeds that had survived, things she could only imagine were beginning the slow, irreversible work of deciding whether this place was worth growing in. She believed it was. She went inside and turned off the lamp and went to bed and slept more soundly than she had in months, because the can was empty and the seeds were in the ground, and whatever came next, it would come to a woman who had already done what needed doing. Cole did not sleep the night after the seeds went in. Willa heard him in the kitchen at 2 a.m, the particular careful sound of a young man trying not to make sound, and she lay in the dark and let him have it. The kitchen, and the worry, and the hour, because some things cannot be shortened by company. She had been awake herself, not with doubt, with the specific alertness that follows a decision already made and acted on the mind, no longer moving backward but forward, tracking consequence, the way a farmer tracks weather, not to stop it, but to be ready for it. On the 6th morning, the first true leaves pushed through the tepary rows along the east fence. Small and dark and deliberate, emerging from cracked soil, with the unhurried authority of something designed for exactly this. Willa walked the strip before sunrise and wrote the germination rate in her notebook and went back to the house without telling anyone. Cole found them when he went out at 7. He came back inside and stood at the window with his back to her for a long moment. "They came up," he said. "Yes." He sat down. He looked at his hands on the table the way his father used to look at things that had rearranged what he thought he understood. Then he said quietly, more to the table than to her, "I called Garland cross last week." She did not move. He said, "You should think hard about what you are doing." Cole's voice was careful and miserable in equal measure. He said, "Agricon does not wait. That if you hold long enough, you will not like what comes next." "What did you say to him?" "I said I would think about it." She closed the notebook on the table. The sound it made in the quiet kitchen was very small and very final. "This land is not a negotiating position," she said. She said it without anger, which was the version of it that landed hardest. "It is not a thing we are weighing. Your grandmother put her hands in this ground in the early years of this century when you were not yet born, and I was not yet born, and the people who farmed it before us did not farm it by selling it when it got hard." She looked at him directly. "I need you to understand the difference between what I am doing and what Agricon is offering. One of them ends. The other continues." Cole sat with that. "Get your boots," she said. "We have work." He got his boots. The anonymous notice came 4 days later, slid under the front door before dawn on a Tuesday. Plain paper, no letterhead handwriting she did not recognize. A meeting called for Friday evening at the First Lutheran. The agenda included a formal vote on collective land negotiation with Midwest Agricon. Landowners who did not attend would be considered to have abstained in favor of the majority position. She read it twice, set it on the corner of the table, went out to check the east fence strip where the amaranth had joined the tepary in breaking through the soil, its seedlings already showing the faint, reddish tinge that meant it was doing what amaranth does under heat stress, building its own protection, coloring itself against a summer that had not finished with any of them yet. Hatch came back that afternoon. This time, Cole was near the fence when the SUV pulled in, and Hatch stopped there first, which Willa saw from the kitchen window. She watched the two of them in the yard, Hatch with his hands easy at his sides, Cole with his arms crossed and his weight shifted back, the way he stood when he was uncomfortable, but working to conceal it. She watched for 3 minutes. Then she put down the dish towel and went outside. Hatch turned toward her with the smooth adjustment of a man accustomed to pivoting without appearing to. He said, "Good afternoon." He said he had been having a useful conversation with Cole about the long-term structures Agricon offered to families who wanted to remain connected to their land through the transition. She looked at Cole. Cole looked at the fence post to his left. "Mr. Hatch." She said his name without raising her voice. "The last time we spoke, I told you to knock on the front door." He opened his mouth. She continued, "You walked past my front door and spoke to my son in my yard without my knowledge. That is the second time you have come onto this property without invitation." Hatch recalibrated. The professional warmth adjusted into something more direct, stripped of its courtesy the way a tool gets stripped of its handle when the grip is no longer useful. "Mrs. Vance." He said her name the way people say names when they want the name itself to carry a meaning. "I want to be transparent with you. The equipment loan from First Agricultural comes up for review in November. In a drought year with no harvest, to report that review will have a particular character." He let that settle. "Agricon has no interest in your difficulty. We are offering you a solution." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the east fence strip. "That strip along the fence," she said. "Do you know what is growing there?" He glanced toward it. "Green plants." He said it like a category, not a recognition. "Those plants have not been irrigated once since they went in the ground." She said it plainly. 43 days without rain on soil, your company has classified as marginal. She paused. "In November, when your project goes to the county for aquifer impact review, I am going to submit 14 years of water table observation data for this corridor to the state engineer's office. You should make sure your people have read it before that meeting." Hatch went still. Cole went still. The man from Agricon looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has just understood that what they thought they were looking at was something different, and the recalculation is not in their favor. He said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he said he appreciated her candor and hoped she would reconsider, and he walked back to the SUV with the slightly too deliberate pace of a man who did not want to appear to be retreating. When the engine sound faded down the county road, Cole turned to look at her. She was already walking back toward the house. "What is in that notebook?" he said. "The one about the water. 14 years of watching what this ground drinks and where it goes." He caught up with her at the porch steps. He said, "Does Cross know about the water data?" She stopped on the first step, turned halfway toward him. "He has never asked." That evening, she sat at the writing desk and opened the 20-second notebook to the February entry she had not shown anyone. She read it with the attention of someone preparing to release something that has been held private, not out of secrecy, but out of the understanding that information offered too early becomes noise, and information offered at the right moment becomes proof. The data on the aquifer recharge zone was clear. It had been clear since 1963. The corridor Agricon intended to acquire sat directly above the primary shallow aquifer for the east and south sections of the county. Industrial center pivot irrigation at the proposed scale would draw the water table down in ways that the current farming practices had never approached, and the effects would not announce themselves dramatically. They would arrive the way droughts arrive in southwestern Kansas, slowly, quietly, until one day a farmer looked up and understood that what had seemed like a temporary problem had become something that would outlast everyone in the room. She closed the notebook, placed her hand flat on the cover. Friday came with a sky gone the color of old brass in the west, an air that pressed against everything and made sound carry further than it should across the flat, open miles. Willa changed her shirt and drove to the First Lutheran and parked among the trucks in the gravel lot and walked in without being invited because she had been farming this county since before most of the men in that room had their names on a deed. The room held perhaps 30 people, folding chairs in rows facing a table at the front where Garland Cross stood with a county map pinned to the board behind him. Red marks on the map, 7 parcels already signed forming a corridor that ran northeast to southwest directly above the aquifer zone. Willa looked at that corridor and felt the February notebook entry as a weight in her chest, patient and dense, waiting for its moment. Doyle Hatch sat at the end of the table with his hands folded, and the expression of a man who had already counted the room and found the arithmetic satisfactory. Phil Garrett sat to Cross's left with the slightly collapsed posture of someone who understood that his role tonight was to provide institutional credibility rather than independent judgment. When Willa walked in, the nearest conversation stopped in the progressive way. Silence spreads when someone unexpected arrives. Cross turned. He looked at her without visible surprise, which told her he had been told she might come, and without visible welcome, which told her everything else. Willa. He said her name the way he had said it at 30 county meetings over 20 years as an acknowledgement that was also a placement. She took a seat in the 4th row. Cole, she saw, was already in the back row against the wall. He had not told her he was coming. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived at the same place by a different road and is uncertain what to make of the coincidence. Cross presented the Agricon offer with the practiced fluency of a man who had already made his own decision and was performing the consultation as a courtesy to the outcome. He had numbers and projections and a representative from the county agricultural office, and the map with its 7 red marks and the implicit argument of the map, which was that momentum was already established and the question was no longer whether but how many. The floor opened for discussion. Henderson spoke about the harvest losses. Murphy's oldest son spoke about the loan review coming in November. A man from the South section asked about the equity structure, and Hatch leaned forward and answered, in the smooth, detailed cadence of someone who had answered the same question in many rooms. Willa raised her hand. Cross looked at the hands, looked at hers, called on Henderson, who had already spoken, called on a man near the window, called on someone from the Grain Cooperative Board. Willa kept her hand up without varying the height or the angle. The room began to notice, not loudly. She saw eyes moving to her hand and back to Cross, the small recalibration of a group registering that something was being avoided. Cross called on 2 more people. Then there was no one left. He looked at her. Willa. She stood up without notes. She said that she had 14 years of water table observation data for the aquifer corridor, running beneath the parcels under discussion tonight. Data that showed seasonal recharge patterns and extraction tolerance thresholds that had not appeared in any of the material Agricon had presented. She said that before the room voted on anything, she believed that information was relevant to what they were agreeing to. The room was quiet. Cross said, "Do you have documentation?" 22 notebooks, some going back to 1955. Garrett shifted in his chair. "Those are personal journals, Willa." Cross said it with the measured tone of a man choosing words carefully in public. Kept by an individual without formal methodology. 22 years of daily entries. She said it without heat. Soil moisture, rainfall, aquifer level estimates based on well depth measurements taken every spring and fall since 1963. The recharge zone for the primary shallow aquifer in this county sits directly under the corridor Agricon is acquiring. Center pivot irrigation at the proposed scale will draw it down faster than natural recharge can replace it. In 7 years, possibly fewer, the salinity in the east and south. Well fields will begin to change. In 15 years, farming in this corridor is a different enterprise from the one any of us have practiced. The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of people who had not thought about something and had now begun to think about it. Cross said, "That is a significant claim. Supported by records that have never been reviewed, never been submitted for verification, never been seen by anyone in this county's agricultural structure. Phil Garrett." She said his name clearly. "You have seen them. You kept one of my notebooks for 6 months in 1972. Garrett looked at his hands. 1972, Cole said from the back of the room, quietly. A correction rather than a challenge, but the room heard it. Willa looked at Cross. "You have been farming this county for 30 years, Garland." She said it without accusation, as observation, as plain fact. "You have never once asked me what I know about the ground under your south section. I am not asking you to take my word for it. I am asking you before you sign away the land above that aquifer to want someone to check." Cross held her gaze for a moment that extended past what he intended. Then he looked at the room and said, "The meeting would recess for 10 minutes. Chairs scraped and people stood, and the sound of 30 farmers beginning a different conversation from the one they had come in expecting to have filled the room from wall to wall. Hatch was looking at her from the table, not with anger, with the focused, recalibrating attention of a man revising a model he had thought was finished. Cole appeared beside her chair. He crouched down so they were at the same level and said quietly, "That envelope on the table at home. I addressed it. I never sent it. I want you to know that." She looked at him, his father's face in the yellow light of the Lutheran hall, honest and open and trying. "I know," she said. He stayed crouched a moment longer. "Then the water data. Is it what you said it is up there?" She looked at the map with its red marks and its corridor, and the 7 parcels already gone. Every word she said. He nodded. He stood and went back to the wall. Cross did not call for a vote when the meeting reconvened. He said the proposal would be tabled for 2 weeks, pending a review of available environmental data. Hatch made one notation on the pad in front of him and did not speak again. He did not look at Willa when the meeting ended. Driving home in the dark, Cole said, "He's going to come back harder. Probably. The bank thing. He will make it real." She looked at the road. "Ma." He said it the way he had said it at 12 when something had frightened him, and he would not say so directly. "What do you need me to do?" She thought about the east fence strip, and the tepary leaves and the amaranth coloring. Itself in the heat and the dry summer bean at the far end of the row, growing without drama or announcement, doing exactly what it had been kept to do. "Start a notebook," she said. "Begin with the south field. Write down what the soil does in the last week of August. That is where we start." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I should have done it years ago." The road ran through the flat dark of the Kansas night, and the stars above it were very clear and very far, and the land on both sides held itself in the particular stillness of ground that is waiting, not resting, but waiting for the thing it already knows is coming. 4 days after the Lutheran meeting, a government truck turned down Willa's gravel drive and stopped. The young woman who stepped out was 23 years old with a degree from Kansas State and 11 months of county work, in the specific bewilderment of someone whose training had given her excellent tools for measuring things she had seen before, and no preparation for what she was looking at now. Her name was Beth Calloway. She had been driving the assessment routes for a week, and she had seen what Drought looked like from every angle the county offered, and nothing in any of those angles had prepared her for the east fence strip at the Vance property, which was green in the specific, aggressive way that means not surviving, but thriving. She had pulled over and stood at the fence for 2 minutes before Willa came around the side of the barn. "You are the new soil conservation officer," Willa said. "Beth Calloway." She extended her hand. The grip was firm and unperformed. Her eyes were moving between Willa's face and the plants with the unself-conscious attention of someone genuinely trying to understand something. "What are those?" "Tepary bean mostly. Some amaranth. A dry summer variety that does not have a commercial name." Beth walked the fence line slowly. The tepary was on its second true leaves. The amaranth stood several inches, its lower leaves edged in that reddish purple that meant anthocyanin production, the plant making its own protection against the assault of a season that had not finished with any of them. Beth looked at the plants the way Willa's mother had looked at plants, with her whole attention not cataloging, but listening. "How much water have you given these?" "None." Beth turned and looked at her. "None," Willa said again. Beth stood still and did the calculations that Willa could see moving across her face. The soil moisture baselines, the precipitation records, the temperature data, and the fact of these plants in front of her, which did not fit any of those numbers. She was not writing on her clipboard. She was writing on her hand. "Can I look at your records?" Beth said. Willa studied her for a moment. The ink on the side of her index finger, the way she had written down tepary bean and asked how to spell it instead of nodding as though she already knew. "Come in," Willa said. "I will put coffee on." The 22 notebooks were not what Beth had expected. She read without speaking for 40 minutes. Willa sat across the table and did not explain anything, and felt quietly and without display the particular sensation of work that has been private for a very long time encountering, for the first time, someone who knows how to read it. Beth looked up from the notebook open in front of her, which was from 1960, and said, "This drought prediction. You wrote this 6 months before it happened. I observed a pattern. I wrote what I observed. The Extension Office issued its advisory in July of that year." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. July of 1961 was 4 months after Willa had written it down. Beth looked at the stack of 22 notebooks. Then she looked at the small green notebook Willa had moved to the far corner of the table when she brought the others out. It was older and smaller and written in a different hand. Beth looked at it once and did not ask about it. Willa noticed the not asking. It was the right instinct. "Mrs. Vance." Beth's voice had shifted from the professional register she had used at the fence. This was something less managed, something with more actual attention in it. "Why has no one seen these?" No one asked. "Did you ever try to share them?" "With the Extension Office with the university. Once. In 72. Beth looked at the stack again. Then she said, "Will you let me take soil samples from the East Strip? I want to send them to a contact at Kansas State. Someone I trust." "What are you expecting to find?" "I am not sure yet." Beth said it honestly, which Willa appreciated more than a professional answer would have allowed. But those plants should not exist right now by any model I was taught, and the reason they do is either in the seeds or in the soil, or in something between the two that my training does not have a name for. It is all three, Willa said. Take your samples. She paused. But I want to see what you write before it goes anywhere official. Of course. And Beth. She waited until the young woman looked up. Do not call what you find a discovery. It is not new. It is old. There is a difference between those two things, and it matters. Beth looked at her for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and wrote something and turned it so Willa could see. She had written, not a discovery. It is old. Below that, she had written, ask about the green notebook. Willa looked at those 4 words. Then she looked at Beth. Not yet, she said. But you are asking the right question. Beth came back 2 days later with sampling equipment and her own notebook, and they walked the strip together. In the early morning, with the quiet, focused attention of 2 people who understand the same kind of language and are relieved to have found each other. Beth asked questions and wrote down the answers without paraphrasing them, which Willa had not expected and which meant more than she would have predicted. On the 25th of August, the Greer County Gazette ran a half-column item with no byline describing without naming anyone a landowner in the west section pursuing unconventional methods during the drought who had declined to participate in regional cooperative solutions. The phrase cooperative solutions appeared twice. A local agricultural professional was quoted saying that individual approaches during collective crises placed additional strain on county resources. Cole brought the paper in and set it on the table without saying what they both already knew. Willa read it, folded it, slid it under the basil pot on the windowsill as a drainage tray, and went back to what she was doing. Beth came by that afternoon with a copy of the same article and an expression working to stay professional and not fully succeeding. She said she believed Hatch had sourced the item. Willa said she knew. Beth said, "Are you going to respond?" Willa said no. "Come outside. The amaranth is 11 inches today." They went out to the fence, and Beth measured and wrote it down. Then she looked up with the afternoon light on her face and said, "The preliminary results came this morning from Kansas State." Willa did not speak. The soil organic matter in the East Strip is significantly higher than any baseline I have collected in this county. The microbial activity is outside the normal regional range. Not degraded. She paused. Enhanced. The lab contact asked me how long this section had been under conservation management. 14 years, Willa said. Beth wrote it down. Then she said, "My supervisor called me this morning. Someone reported my visits here. He asked me to redirect my assessment efforts." Willa looked at her. "Are you afraid?" Beth was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "No." She said it the way a person says something they have just decided, rather than something they already knew. Then she said, "I want to know what is in that green notebook." The wind had come up from the southwest, dry and patient. The same wind that had been there for weeks. Willa looked at the fence strip and the plants in it and the sky above them. She thought about 14 years of numbers sitting in notebooks no one had thought to ask about. She thought about Beth Calloway writing on her hand at the fence line because she had run out of room in her notebook. "Not yet," Willa said. "But send the samples directly to Kansas State. Not through your office. To your contact there." Beth looked at her carefully. "That goes over my supervisor's head." "Yes," Willa said. "It does." Beth stood in the field for a long moment. Then she opened her notebook, found a clean page, and wrote down an email address at the top of it. That evening, Willa carried the green notebook up from the root cellar and set it on the kitchen table. She did not open it immediately. She sat with both hands on the cover and listened to the house and the fields outside and the particular silence of a Kansas night in late August, which is the silence of a place that is very old and has survived a great many things, and is not particularly afraid of the next one. Then she opened to the middle section and found the passage about the 3 droughts. She read it in her mother's handwriting, the Norwegian and the English woven together In the way they had always been woven, the two languages her mother had never entirely separated, because to her, they had never been separate things. The drought of water, the drought of knowledge, the drought of trust. She read the third one twice. The condition in which the people who hold the knowledge of how to survive the other two droughts are not believed, not asked, not listened to, not because they have nothing to say, because of what they are. She looked out the kitchen window at the east fence strip, invisible in the dark, and she thought about Beth Calloway deciding something at a fence line with ink on her hand. She thought about 30 farmers in folding chairs beginning a different conversation from the one they had come to have. She thought about Phil Garrett looking at his hands when she said his name. She picked up the telephone. Beth answered on the second ring. "I need you to bring your contact from Kansas State out here," Willa said. "Not your supervisor, the one you trust. The results are not complete yet." "I know." Willa put her hand flat on the open page of the green notebook. "But what I need to show him does not require a laboratory to understand." A pause on the line. Then Beth said, "What is it?" Willa looked at her mother's handwriting on the page in front of her, the brown ink and the careful forward-leaning script, and the words that had been waiting in that notebook since a woman in Bergen had written them down in a year that Willa had never seen and could only imagine. "It is the reason the seeds exist at all," she said. "And it is the reason none of this is finished yet." She did not sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of wakefulness from the ones before. The earlier nights had been the wakefulness of waiting, of holding something unresolved in the dark until morning gave it shape. This night was different. This was the wakefulness of a woman who had said out loud what she had been carrying quietly for 11 years and who understood that saying it had set something in motion that would not stop moving until it had gone as far as it was going to go. She made coffee before 4 and sat at the writing desk with the green notebook open in front of her and the 20-second composition book beside it. She read her mother's handwriting and then her own and then her mother's again. And what she was doing was not studying, but preparing the way a person prepares before speaking to a room. Not practicing words, but settling into the weight of what the words will carry. Dr. Warren Foss arrived from Manhattan on the morning of September 28th in a station wagon with 2 graduate students and the particular, careful manner of a man who had spent decades in the company of data and had learned not to arrive at conclusions before the evidence invited him. He was 58 years old, silver-haired with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the unhurried quality of someone who had seen enough in his career to know that the things worth seeing rarely announced themselves loudly. Beth had called ahead. She had told Willa that Foss was the kind of scientist who did not get excited in observable ways, and that if he got excited, it would look from the outside like mild interest, and that mild interest from Warren Foss was the equivalent of most people climbing out of their chairs. What Beth had not told Willa, because she had not thought to mention it until his car was already in the drive, was that she had also called Phil Garrett. Willa was on the porch when the station wagon pulled in, and she saw the second vehicle behind it, a county truck she recognized, and she understood before Garrett stepped out what Beth had done and why, and she stood with her coffee cup and let the understanding settle without deciding yet what she thought about it. Garrett walked up to the porch ahead of Foss. He was a man in his mid-40s who had been in the county extension office long enough to have accumulated the particular wariness of someone who has been wrong in public more than once and has not forgotten the cost of it. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. "I should have come sooner," he said. He said it simply without the architecture of justification that people usually build around an apology, and because of that simplicity, it landed as a true thing rather than a managed one. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You should have. Come in. I made enough coffee." He came in. Cole was already at the kitchen table when they came through the door, and he looked at Garrett with an expression that he managed to keep neutral, which Willa noted and appreciated. Foss introduced himself and his two students with the brisk courtesy of a man who preferred to get to the work, and Willa set cups on the table and opened the 22 composition notebooks in chronological order and said, "Start wherever you need to." Foss started at the beginning. He read the way Beth had read without speaking, but differently, with the slight forward lean of a man in whose professional attention had been fully engaged, his glasses coming down from his forehead to his nose within the first 3 minutes and not moving again. His students stood behind him and read over his shoulder, and one of them stopped taking notes at some point and simply read which Willa noticed. Beth sat beside Garrett at the far end of the table. She had her own notebook open. She was writing, but she was also watching Willa with the attention of someone who understands they are in the presence of a moment that will not repeat. Garrett read one of the middle notebooks, the one from 1968, the year Willa had begun the legume rotation along the east fence line. He read slowly. He turned pages carefully. Once he set the notebook down and looked at the wall for a moment, and then picked it up again. After 40 minutes, Foss set the notebook he was holding down on the table with a deliberateness that quieted the room. He looked at Willa across the table, Mrs. Vance. He said her name with a precision that carried respect rather than formality. These are original observations, conducted systematically over 22 years by an individual without institutional support or peer review. He paused. In terms of what they document about this specific section of aquifer and soil ecology, I am not aware of anything comparable in the published literature for this region. She looked at him steadily. He said, "I need to see the other notebook," the one Beth described. She had known this was coming. She had been sitting with the knowing of it since 4 a.m. She reached to the shelf behind her and brought the green notebook to the table and set it in front of him. He picked it up with both hands. He read the cover first, the way a person reads a thing they understand to be rare, and then he opened it, and the room was quiet enough that Willa could hear the specific sound of the pages turning, that old paper sound, dry and particular, like something breathing that has not breathed in a long time. He read for a long time. His students had stopped moving. Beth had stopped writing. Garrett sat very still with his hands flat on the table. When Foss put the notebook down, his expression had not changed dramatically, which Beth had said it would not, but something in the quality of his stillness had shifted. He removed his glasses and held them and looked at Willa. "The seed varieties your mother collected," he said. "The Tepary strain specifically, and what you are calling the dry summer bean." He stopped. "These are not in the USDA National Germplasm Database. They are not in any regional seed bank I have access to." He paused again, choosing his next words with the care of a man who understood they were going to matter. "The variety your mother described in this notebook as resilient in conditions of extreme moisture deficit, and which has just produced harvestable yield in a county experiencing near total crop failure." He looked at her. "Mrs. Vance, that variety may not exist anywhere else in the country in any documented form." The kitchen was very quiet. Cole, in the corner where he had been sitting since the meeting began, stood up. He did not say anything. He went to the back door and opened it and stepped outside into the yard. Willa heard his boots on the porch steps and then on the gravel and then nothing. She did not go after him. She knew where he had gone. She knew what he was standing in front of. Garrett said quietly, without looking up from the table, "Your mother brought these seeds from Norway." "From Bergen," Willa said, "in 1921. She packed them in a cloth with lavender against the insects." Garrett was quiet for a moment. He said, "I kept your notebook for 6 months in 72, and gave it back without saying a word to you? Yes. He looked at her then. He was not performing contrition. He was simply sitting with what was true. I read it, he said. I read it, and I knew you were doing something I did not have a framework for, and instead of finding a framework, I put it in a drawer. He stopped. I am sorry for that, Willa. I am genuinely sorry. She looked at him for a long time. The specific emotion she felt was not simple enough to have a clean name. It was something that included the 22 years of notebooks and the 6 months of silence, and the meeting at the Lutheran Hall, and Phil Garrett looking at his hands when she said his name, and also something older than all of that. Something that had to do with her mother, walking fields that had been sold, and the tin can on the third shelf, and the particular endurance required to be right about something for a very long time without an audience. I know you are, she said finally. She meant it. That is where we start. Foss had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man who understood he was witnessing something that was not his to interrupt. Now he leaned forward and said, Mrs. Vance, I need to ask you something directly. The seed preservation methodology your mother practiced. What you have continued the maintaining of reserve varieties in rotation outside the main crop. The deliberate soil building across decades. Has anyone ever formally documented this as an agricultural practice? No one has asked about it, she said. He looked at Beth, then back at Willa. We need to talk about what happens next. Cole came back inside 20 minutes later. He came in quietly and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room at Foss and his students and Garrett and Beth and his mother at the head of the table with the green notebook and the 22 composition books arranged around her, like something that had been waiting for exactly this configuration of people. He looked at it all, and then he crossed the kitchen and sat down in his chair and said to Foss, What does it mean? Practically. Foss looked at him. It means that what your mother has maintained on this property represents a category of agricultural heritage that the scientific community has largely failed to document before it disappears. He said it plainly without softening. The varieties in your east field, if they are what the preliminary data suggests, they are carry genetic information about drought adaptation that plant breeders have been trying to reconstruct from incomplete records for 30 years. He paused. They have been here, in a tin can on a shelf, because one woman in Bergen understood something in 1921 that the agricultural establishment is still catching up to. Cole looked at his mother. She was looking at the green notebook. Then Foss said, There is also the matter of the aquifer data. He looked at Garrett. Fill the February entry in Notebook 22. You need to read it today. Not eventually. Today. Garrett nodded. In the project currently under county review, Foss said carefully, the industrial acquisition proposal. If the aquifer impact data in these notebooks is accurate, and I have no reason to believe it is not, then the environmental assessment that proposal requires under federal review standards has not been conducted. An agricultural operation receiving federal irrigation infrastructure support cannot proceed without one. Beth looked up from her notebook. She said Agricon's center pivot proposal includes a federal drought relief infrastructure grant, filed in August. The room understood what that meant without anyone saying it. Garrett said I can file a formal request for an independent aquifer assessment through the state engineer's office by end of week. He said it the way a man says something he should have said a long time ago and has finally found the nerve for. If the data supports what Willa has documented, the assessment will flag the recharge zone. The federal grant review cannot proceed until that flag is resolved. Beth was already writing. Willa sat at the head of the table and looked at the people in her kitchen, and felt something she had not felt since the morning she pried open the tin can. Something that was not triumph and not relief, but was the specific feeling of a thing that has been in the right place all along, finally being seen by enough eyes to become real. She stood up. She said, "There is coffee, and I have beans ready from the first harvest. I want everyone to see the field before the light changes." They went out in the golden September afternoon. All of them, Foss and his students, and Garrett and Beth and Cole, and they walked the east fence strip together, while Willa walked ahead of them, not explaining but showing, pointing at the tepary pods heavy on the vine, the amaranth standing 6 feet with its seed heads red gold and dense, the dry summer bean at the far end of the row, producing its small kidney-shaped pods on compact plants that had not been watered once in 46 days. One of Foss's students, a young man who had been very quiet all morning, crouched down at the tepary row and looked at the pods for a long time. Then he looked up at Willa. "How many generations has your family kept this variety?" She considered. "My mother kept it for 40 years before she gave it to me. Her mother kept it before that." She paused. "I do not know how far back the original variety goes. My mother's notebook does not say. It says only that it is old and that it knows how to wait." The student looked at the pod in his hand and then carefully set it back on the vine. Hatch came on the 3rd of October. He came alone this time, without the second man and without the briefcase. And he parked outside the gate rather than coming into the yard, which was a change Willa noticed before she noticed anything else about him. She let him stand there for 10 minutes in the October sun before she walked out to the gate. He looked tired in a way that his suit could not conceal. The easy professional certainty she had seen in August was still present, but it was carrying something now, a weight behind the eyes of a man who has been making calls that have not gone the way he expected. "Mrs. Vance." He said her name without the implication it had carried before. "Mr. Hatch." He looked at the east fence strip. The plants were at full growth. Now the tepary pods hanging heavy, the amaranth seed heads beginning to dry at the tips in the cooling air. He looked at them for a long moment. "You spoke to someone at the state engineer's office," he said. "I shared data with a colleague who spoke to the state engineer's office. The aquifer assessment has been flagged." He said it flatly. "The federal grant review is suspended pending independent environmental study." He paused. "The acquisitions in this county are on hold indefinitely." She said nothing. He looked at her. He was not performing anything now. The suit and the MBA and the regional office in Wichita and the 12 counties in 3 states were all still present, but they were not doing the work they usually did. He said, "I want to understand something. You have been on this land your whole life. You had data that would have done exactly this from the beginning. Why did you wait?" She looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at the east fence strip in the morning, with attention that was not hostile and not warm, but was completely present. Because data offered before anyone is ready to hear it becomes noise, she said. "I needed the drought to be real before the data could be useful. I needed the seeds to be in the ground before I could show anyone what they were." She paused. "And I needed someone to come onto my land and threaten my son before I was willing to spend what I had been saving." Hatch was quiet for a long time. He looked at the field, and then at her, and then at the field again. Then he said quietly, without the professional register, "Entirely I have a daughter. She is 7. He stopped. "I do not know why I am telling you that." Willa looked at him for a moment. "Because you are standing in front of something that is going to outlast both of us," she said. "And that is not as comfortable as you thought it would be." He nodded once, very slightly. Then he walked back to his vehicle and drove away down the county road, and she watched him go, without satisfaction and without grief, the way you watch weather move through that was necessary and is now finished. Garland Cross came on the 5th of October. He came alone and parked outside the gate, the same way Hatch had, and Willa saw him do it, and understood that something had shifted in the county's understanding of what this property was. He walked up to the gate and stopped. He was a large man, 60-some years old, with the bearing of someone who had been the largest presence in most rooms for most of his life, and had organized his understanding of himself around that fact. He was holding his hat. He said, "I said things about you this summer that I did not examine carefully enough before I said them." She looked at him. He said, "I was frightened, and I did not want to admit it, so I found other things to be instead." He paused. "You were not one of those other things. You should not have been. It was not an elegant apology. It was the kind that costs something, which made it worth more than an elegant one." She said, "You were scared, and you found a direction for it. There are worse things a man can do when he is scared." She opened the gate. "Come in. I want to talk to you about the South Field." He came in. They sat on the back porch with coffee, and she told him what she had told very few people about the south section of the county, about the aquifer and the recharge patterns and the specific vulnerability of the soil structure in dry years to the kind of compaction that conventional heavy equipment produced at scale. She told him without notes from memory from 14 years of walking and measuring and writing it down in notebooks that she had kept because her mother had taught her that the ground remembers what you give it, and you should have the courtesy to remember too. Cross listened. He did not interrupt. He set his hat on his knee and held his coffee cup in both hands and listened the way a man listens when he has decided that the cost of not listening is higher than the cost of his own discomfort. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "How do I start?" She said, "The same way everything starts. You pay attention to what is already there, and you write down what you see." He nodded slowly. He looked out at the east fence strip, an immense strip where Cole was doing the afternoon walk through, moving along the rows with a notebook of his own, now stopping every few feet to crouch and look and write. Cross watched him for a moment. "Your boy," he said. "He has your way of looking at things." She looked at Cole in the field. She thought about the morning in the kitchen when he had asked where to begin, and she had said with the soil, and he had gone out and not come back inside until dark. And when he came back inside, his notebook had 12 pages of writing in it, small and careful in his own particular hand, that was nothing like hers and nothing like his father's, but was entirely his own. "He is getting there," she said. Cole looked up from the row and saw Cross on the porch and held his gaze for a moment. Something passed between the two of them that Willa could not fully read. Something that had to do with the summer and the envelope addressed to Wichita that had never been sent, and the phone call to Cross that had been made, and the meeting at the Lutheran Hall, and all the small accumulated choices of a young man finding out what he was made of under pressure. Then Cole looked back down at the plants and kept walking the row. The rains came on the 11th of October. They came without drama, an inch and a half over 2 days. The kind of rain that smells different from a single storm arriving on a wind that has changed direction and carrying in it the suggestion of more to come. The county exhaled. Not completely, not without the lingering awareness of how close it had been and how much had been lost, but the acute fear, the particular breathlessness of people watching their livelihoods die, increment by increment that eased. The Tepary harvest came in at nearly 800 pounds per acre. The amaranth exceeded a ton. The dry summer bean yielded less, but it yielded, and what it yielded Willa counted and weighed and recorded, in the 22nd notebook with the same care she had given every entry for 22 years, because the number mattered not as a triumph, but as a data point. One more entry in a record that was not finished, that would not be finished as long as there was someone to continue it. She set aside the seed stock first. Before the yield calculations, before the distribution planning, before anything else. She separated from each variety the portion that would go back into the ground, the portion that would be shared with Beth's program at Kansas State, and the portion that would stay on the Vance property in labeled jars on the shelf where the tin can had been. Not because she was afraid, because this was what the tin can had taught her. You keep something back, not from fear, but from understanding. The future needs a reserve as much as the present needs a harvest. Beth came the week the harvest was finished, and they sat at the kitchen table with the yield numbers and the soil reports and the preliminary findings from Kansas State spread between them, and Beth said, "The program at the experiment station is moving forward. They want to formalize the seed preservation documentation. Use your mother's methodology as the model for a regional initiative." Willa said, "Are they going to say where it comes from?" Beth looked at her directly. "I will not let them not to." It was the right answer. They both knew it was the right answer, and the moment between them had the weight of two women who understood something specific about how institutions absorb knowledge that comes from inconvenient sources and how the only protection against that absorption is vigilance and repetition, and someone in the room who was there at the beginning and will not let the origin be forgotten. Good Willa said, "Now let me show you the rest of the notebooks. There are things in the middle ones I have not shown anyone." Beth opened her own notebook. She was ready. Cole came in from the field at the end of that day and sat down at the table and set his notebook beside his mother's and opened it to the first page, which was dated the morning after the Lutheran meeting, and said, "I want to go through this with you. Tell me what I am seeing wrong." She looked at his handwriting on the first page. She read the first entry, which was a description of the soil condition in the South Field's eastern corner. On a morning in late August, the specific quality of the surface crust and the depth at which moisture could still be detected and the particular way the remaining wheat had positioned its leaves in the heat, which he had noted with a precision that she had not expected and which told her something she had not quite known before about what her son had absorbed over 26 years of living on this land without being aware that he was learning it. She read to the end of the entry. Then she looked up at him. "You are not seeing anything wrong," she said. "You are seeing what is there." He looked at her with his father's face in the kitchen light, that honest, open architecture. And she saw in it something that Raymond had never quite developed, which was the specific patience of a person who has chosen to pay attention as a practice rather than an obligation. She got up and went to the shelf and brought down a new composition notebook, still sealed, and set it on the table in front of him. "This is yours," she said. "Not a copy of mine. Yours. You observe differently from me. That is not a problem." She paused. "It is the point." He looked at the notebook for a moment. Then he opened it to the first page and wrote the date at the top and looked at her. "Where do we start?" She sat back down across from him. She thought about the east fence strip in the dark, the seeds in the soil before the first light, the specific quality of patience that is not waiting, but preparing. She thought about her mother in Bergen, with seeds packed in lavender, about the Navajo seed keeper, with both hands on an envelope, about the Mennonite farmer saying these are for when times change, and times always change. She thought about the tin can on the shelf for 11 years, and the 2 words on the tape, and the understood third word that made the instruction complete. She thought about what she had told Beth about the green notebook, that it was not a discovery, but something old. and she understood that this was also true of what was sitting across the table from her. Now her son, with a new notebook and the right question and the patience to hear the answer, which was not new, had never been new, was in fact the oldest thing she knew. With the soil, she said. Always with the soil. Tell me what you see when you walk the south corner in the morning. Tell me the way you would write it down. Cole looked out the window at the field in the October dusk. The rain-wet ground and the plants coming back from the edge of what they had almost not survived, and the east fence strip standing in the last of the light with the specific authority of something that had been designed for exactly the conditions it had been given. He said, "It smells different after rain, not like before. There is something in it now. That is the biology waking up," she said. "Write that down. That is where you begin." He wrote it down. Outside, the night came in from the west, the way it always did on the Kansas plain all at once, and completely the sky, going from the deep blue of late dusk to full dark in the space of a few minutes, the stars emerging not gradually, but in a sudden presence, as though they had been there all along, and the light had simply been keeping them quiet. The fields lay in every direction around the house, rain-wet and dark and alive in the way that things are alive when they have come very close to the edge of not being and have held on anyway. On the shelf in the root cellar, where the tin can had been, there was now a row of small jars. Each one was labeled in Willa's handwriting. Each one held seeds from the 1977 harvest, dried and sorted and stored with the care that had been passed through 4 generations of women who had understood at the most practical level that abundance comes from restraint and survival comes from keeping something back. The tin can itself sat on the writing desk. The medical tape was still attached. The 2 words still legible in their faded pencil. Do not. And below them, in newer tape, in a hand that was the same but slightly more deliberate, the word she had added on the night the can went empty. Yet, not a prohibition, not a surrender, a timing. The whole instruction was there now, complete the way it had always been complete, waiting only for the 3rd word to make it readable. Do not, yet, which meant hold, which meant the moment will come and you will know it, which meant what you are keeping is not a secret, but a preparation, and the difference between those 2 things is everything. Willa Vance sat at her writing desk on the last night of October and opened a new composition notebook, the 23rd, and wrote the date at the top of the first page, and the weather, and the temperature, and the soil, moisture reading she had taken that afternoon, and then she sat for a moment with the pen in her hand and looked at what her mother had written about the 3 droughts which she had copied into the front of every notebook since 1966. And she thought about what she wanted to say next. She wrote it not for herself and not for any institution, and not for the record that was already being compiled by people with credentials and laboratories and the machinery of official knowledge. She wrote it for the person who would need it, before they knew they needed it, the person she had not met and might never meet, the one who would open this notebook in a dry year, when the clipboard men were saying there was nothing to be done, and the bank was saying there was no more time, and the neighbors were signing things they did not fully understand. The seeds know what to do, she wrote. They have survived things we cannot imagine and built that knowledge into what they are. Trust that the ground knows what to do. It has been building for longer than any person has been farming it. Feed it. Watch it. Let it tell you what it needs. She stopped. She looked out the window at the dark. The drought will come again, she wrote. It always does. The question is not whether you will face it. The question is whether you kept something back. Keep something back. Not because you are afraid, not because you doubt the ground or yourself or the season, But because the future needs a reserve as much as the present needs a harvest, and the most important thing you will ever do on this land may be the thing you chose not to use yet. Your grandmother understood this. She packed it in cloth with lavender and carried it across an ocean. Now it is yours. She closed the notebook. She turned off the lamp. She went to the door and stood for a moment, looking out at the October dark, at the fields and the sky, and the particular stars that hung over southwestern Kansas on a clear night after rain, which were very close and very bright, and had been there long before the first seed went into this ground, and would be there long after the last one was harvested. She went inside. She went to bed. Behind her in the root cellar, the jars sat on the shelf in the dark, holding what they held, doing what seeds do when they are properly kept, which is not sleeping, not waiting, but remembering, carrying in their unremarkable forms everything they had ever survived, ready for the next dry year, ready for the next person who would stand at the edge of a field in the early morning and understand for the first time that the most powerful thing a person can inherit is not land or money or even knowledge, but the particular kind of faith that keeps something back when everything around you says to use it. Now use it all, because this season is the only one that matters. It was never the only season. It never would be.